Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's weekly virtual panels. My name is Ed Niedermeyer. I am the Communications Director here at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We have another discussion today in sort of a series throughout this month that focuses on AVs and the city of tomorrow and the role of AVs, sort of in the growth and development of our cities. And today we look at a really important part of that, which is how AVs and the companies that develop and make them and deploy them and operate them relate to the cities in which they're operating. As I think we'll be able to discuss a lot today, there is sort of a broad context for new technologies coming into cities that has been sort of a potentially a mixed legacy. Again, I'll let our experts here help us understand that rather than trying to do it myself. And we couldn't have really a better group of experts to help us look at this really, really critical aspect of AVs and their role in the city of tomorrow. First off, we have from Ballast Research, the Chief Administrative Office and Senior Advisor, Sabrina Sussman. Sabrina, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ed. Really thrilled to be here.
Yeah, and by the way, all of our guests have very rich backgrounds in a lot of the sort of areas that we'll be discussing today, and I think you'll see that as we continue, rather than try and give everyone's full bio right now. We are also joined today from the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. Marla Westervelt is their head of policy. Marla, welcome.
Thank you. And
from PAVE member Argo AI, Monica Laufer is the Public Policy and Government Relations Manager. Monica, welcome to the PAVE Weekly Virtual Panel.
Thanks, Ed. I'm happy to be here.
So I want to start by sort of looking at a little bit of the background that I referenced earlier here. Cities are as diverse as people. Some are extremely enthusiastic about new mobility technologies coming to their streets and to their cities, and some have had, I guess, great experiences with that, but some have had less than ideal experiences with new startups and other companies bringing new technologies to cities. Sabrina, I want to start with you on this. You've been sort of on both sides here of the private sector, the public sector. I want to get your perspective on this first. How would you characterize some of the history here?
So I think in short, it really depends, which is a great non-answer to a very elegant question. But I have to say, I think back to a couple different experiences from my time. One, when I was at Zipcar, I ran public partnerships on behalf of the company and thought a lot about how we launched in new cities or changed our footprint in new cities and how we did that in partnership. And I think that's an area of a more established company sort of building out a playbook and repeating it time and time again. And you've seen a little bit of a difference in how cities are able to pivot, to be responsive, to roll out the welcome mat when there is sort of a bit of history there. But then I think back on my time, actually working in New York City Hall, and there was a very well covered moment, I'd say, in AV history, where it was announced that an AV company or a company would be bringing their AVs to New York City. There was one slight problem with the announcement, was that no one had told the city of New York. They had told New York State. And for those who know anything about New York politics, it's that there's one thing that does not, that if you make it in one place, you can't make it in the other, because the state and the city are in fact very different entities. And so the day of this very public announcement that AVs were going to be rolling out to Manhattan, the city was caught completely unaware of this very exciting development. And it was while I was there, and we spent a lot of time trying to look back and see where the city may have not set the right tone for that kind of engagement and partnership. But I think one of the things that I certainly learned living through that was that just because you've told one partner doesn't mean you've told multiple. And that just because you have a long history in other areas of partnership doesn't mean that really facilitating a smooth onboarding of a new launch isn't really critical.
Yeah, Marla, and I kind of want to get your perspective on this as well, and maybe whether you have examples within, the context of AVs or perhaps we've seen other mobility technologies, ride hailing, scooters, other ones. Sort of what is maybe some of the legacy of that yeah.
Yeah, so what I would say is that the tenor that was set by the ride hailing companies and specifically companies like Uber really changed the type of relationships that cities have with private sector technology companies. Sabrina highlighted companies like Zipcar came in with a little bit more of a partnership approach, whereas the TNCs came in and said, we're getting too many no's, we're going to do it our own way. As we can see, that played out well for them to proliferate across the world, but created a lot of tension between the public and private sectors. So much so that when scooters were launched, the cities were ready. The cities said, we experienced this before with Uber and Lyft. We have tried to figure out how to make those companies share data with us. We have tried to figure out how to make these companies partner with us because we do have some aligned incentives, and they've refused to. So when scooters came to town, the city said, not so fast. We have regulatory tools that already exist and allow us to be able to set the tone and tenor of this conversation. So they quickly created permits. They quickly, launched a data specification that required operators to produce very, very granular data about their operations to change the balance between the public and private sectors. But I do think that tenor that was set by Uber made it really challenging. But one other thing I want to add is that while the TNCs, I think, are known for creating the playbook of, asking for permission later, if you look to the 90s and you look to the technology partnerships between the public and private sectors, the public sector is often at a loss. You can look at these contracts, and I'm thinking of contracts specifically with fare payment providers, where transit agencies specifically, and sometimes cities, depending on who had those contracts, were put at such a disadvantage to a contract that they didn't fully understand and are still beholden to those contracts today. So I think, we had the last 10 years where that relationship got more tense, but there is a long, long history of information not being distributed equitably to allow both the public and private sectors to make thoughtful decisions on how to best move forward.
Yeah, no, that's really fantastic, that historical context, because this is not just some short-term thing. And similarly, I really love that both of these answers we've gotten so far really also highlight that this is not all a monolithic thing, right? And different companies have different cultures, and importantly, I think different technologies sort of have different attributes that kind of help either shape those cultures or shape the strategies and things like that. And Monica, I wanted to turn to you because one of the things that strikes me as being really interesting about AV is at least the sort of first wave that we're seeing that is sort of moving closer and closer to deployment is that they are level 4, which means in a lot of ways, these vehicles are really being developed and tested and validated for specific cities, right? And so there's a relationship between this technology and the place where it exists and where it operates. And that's a relationship that kind of has to develop over time because, you can't just take an AV from one city, oftentimes a level 4 vehicle from one domain, let's say even, and just drop it into another one. It takes some time. I'm wondering, does this sort of intrinsic aspect of this technology, does this shape sort of how Argo approaches cities where it goes to deploy?
It absolutely impacts our relationships with cities, definitely in a positive way, I would say, actually, because before we expand to any city, we first make sure that we're in touch with the appropriate state and local officials so that they know who Argo is, what our technology does, and that we're very much dedicated to building trust with the communities in which we'll be operating. And then we also conduct regular briefings with emergency responders in the cities and find ways to engage with other community members to provide education. So at Argo, we believe that building trust with communities is really a two-way street. And we want to be proactive in sharing what we're developing, where we'll be testing, and how our plans might develop in the future. So we welcome feedback, and we use all our community engagement opportunities to strongly believe our of that kind of relationship is last year we developed our first in Miami to come together on a regular basis to help make sure that we were listening and learning the community. Ultimately had immediate feedback on what the transportation pain points were, and this is the kind of feedback that you can't really get without living there or conducting extensive customer research. So at the same time, we're able to answer their questions, the board's questions, including some from their networks, and allow them to carry our message forward and hopefully advocate on our behalf. So our founders, Brian Selesky and Pete Rander, have always said, we work street by street, block by block to introduce our self-driving technology. And we've applied that same methodology to educating stakeholders in our test cities.
Yeah. So Marla, I wanted to kind of dig also into a little bit of, into this historic legacy that you talk about, which, as you say, goes back quite deep. I was wondering if you could sort of pick out maybe some of the biggest pitfalls. And I think we've already had some allusions to some of them, but is it attitudes? Are there specific, tactics or decisions or things like that that sort of leap out at you as the pieces of this history that we can learn the most from?
Yeah, I guess two things come to my mind immediately, which is the surprise launch or consumer launch, or however you'd like to brand it, which is when you're an operator and you show up in a city and you don't tell anyone you're going to be there. That method was useful. And I don't think that we can deny that. I think, both in the case of micromobility as well as in the case of TNCs, that allowed both of those suites of companies to be able to demonstrate to the customer and also to the city the value of the products that they were providing. However, it set a horrendous tone for the relationship between the operators and the cities. And I think that we have to learn from that, particularly for autonomous vehicles, which I think is a different type of technology, which necessitates having the governing body there next to you, and that you really, really have to have those conversations, and that it's not appropriate to test that type of technology without permission. And I think more broadly, by having that experience, cities and transit agencies or whomever is the appropriate authority locally is much more willing to have conversations about what products are being brought into their cities. That is now a staffed role often. And the cities are ready to receive what you have to provide and open opportunities for you. And so it is important to start with that. I think another huge pitfall was data sharing. The TNCs specifically were not interested in data sharing. And the reason why is no one's interested in data sharing. If you're a private sector company and you have data that you haven't had to share before, why would you suddenly want to share it with the public sector, whomever? Everyone in the private sector is going to view that data as sensitive business information, regardless if it is or not. There are, I think, really strong arguments to be made about privacy, and some of those are really real arguments, and some of those are scapegoats. And you really do need to navigate that. But I think the experience that we saw with micromobility companies, where the cities had that upper hand and said, no, in order to operate here, you're going to give us that data. It demonstrated that it is entirely possible to share that data without ruining your business. I think that we still have a lot to learn on how to best minimize data sharing and minimize data collection to make sure they're prioritizing the privacy of consumers and individuals. But that is a growing space where it's not just in transportation where that conversation is happening. It's a really complex problem. So I think that those are two key historical things. I think the final thing that I would say is that it's really, really challenging to be a profitable consumer transportation operator within an urban space without partnering with the city. In order to provide an affordable, equitable, and accessible service, it's expensive. And through government partnerships and through understanding how to work with governments, whatever level of government that might be, you're going to set yourself up for much better business success and also longer sustainability within the city to be able to provide a service for whomever needs it.
Yeah. Wow. So much great stuff there. Sabrina, if you'd like to weigh in maybe on the data piece or any piece of what she just said. Also, one of the really interesting things I'd like to maybe hopefully get a little bit more on is just sort of how these local governments have had to evolve their own capacities in order to sort of handle their end of the relationship.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with what Marla's already shared. I'd say that the way that I sort of think about this framework is that you sort of, as a private company, you have two options. You can ask for forgiveness or you can ask for permission. And there may or may not actually be that many shades of gray in between. And that applies to everything from tax policy, safety regulations, data sharing, all of these pieces use that same framework. And so companies really have to sit down and early and often make a decision about which of two camps they're in and how to consistently adhere to that. And that takes resourcing. That takes internal resourcing. That takes people who understand government, who speak government. And frankly, that's not just on the private sector alone. It's also on the cities. And so I do think that cities have had to change pretty dramatically in response to how innovative transportation technologies have rolled out. But it's not new to government, right? And I think one of the things that COVID taught us is that speed is all relative. And so things that we thought would take a really long time, the time scale changed in midst of the pandemic. And so I think New York's actually open dining or on-street dining or closure of streets, safe streets, is a really good example of where political will mixed with good staffing and good capabilities at the local level really was able to meet demand, whether that be of consumers, whether that be of the citizens or the population. There's sort of lots of elements to that. But either way, cities have to be able to spend that time with private sector entities. And I think that's a capacity issue. Not all cities have the kind of staff or the amount of bandwidth available. And I think one thing that's interesting is that transportation is not alone in this. This is happening quite frequently sort of in the economic development space, whether it's with housing or entertainment or other areas like that. And what we're finding is that cities have to be able to replicate the onboarding and the negotiation of a partnership across several departments. And that's really tough because capacity building at the local level is something that for a while may not have been called upon, a muscle that not everyone was using all too often. But I do think the pandemic has really encouraged cities into that forefront pretty quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And Monica, so sort of similarly in a way to how sort of this level 4, as you say, sort of the street by street kind of approach does differentiate AVs from maybe other technologies where you can just sort of scale instantly and so other strategies become sort of viable in ways that they maybe even aren't for AVs. One of the things that leaps out to me is that differentiates AVs from other sort of mobility technologies in particular that have come into cities is sort of this preamble of, we need to earn the public's trust. And of course, trust is an important part of every relationship, right? But I was hoping you'd be able to sort of help people understand why is this something that the AV industry is saying, and maybe sort of how does, that principle sort of translate at street level to informing, how you go about things.
Yeah, so we believe that AV technology has the potential for a positive impact in improving safety and transportation equity and a bunch of other promising applications, but we can't really realize those if the public doesn't trust AVs and our technologies. So that being said, we recognize that the technology is new to the general public, and it's natural for people to be skeptical. We embrace that and we respect the skeptics out there. We don't want to just brush them off and hope that they'll go away. It's important that we're listening to their feedback early on and taking steps to educate them. So when we are scaling our autonomous ride-hailing goods delivery services around the world, we've earned their trust, and we know that we've built a self-driving system that prioritizes the safety of all road users, not just the passengers in the vehicle. And one of the ways that we do that is by taking on questions. So we prefer to take questions versus simply just pushing out a message or a presentation. And that's part of the reason why we created 2 initiatives that are based on tackling questions and taking on skeptics by providing education and insight. So the first one that we do is we publish a digital publication called Ground Truth Autonomy. And it's a wide variety of content that helps explain how our technology works and provides context about the industry trends and news. And then the second is that we produce this podcast called No Parking, which I must tell you all can be found on Apple Podcasts. But in No Parking, we have conversations with interesting people. Sometimes they're in the industry, sometimes they're not in the industry. And they help explain where autonomous vehicles will or won't fit into your life. And it's meant to bring the topic down to a more relatable and hopefully an entertaining level.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of times conversation, right, is how trust is built. And that's really fascinating. And I love especially the perspective about addressing the questions that people have. That's certainly something that we at PAVE take very seriously. And when we do establish conversations like this, they are always informed by the huge amount of questions that we get from the public and various stakeholders. Sabrina, so there seems to be some contrast here, right? And again, this is not, we're not trying to make this too contrived. I think it's we're not trying to say, AVs are always good and other things are always bad. There's a lot of nuance and as you pointed out, a lot of diversity in sort of the different companies and approaches and technologies and all these sorts of things. But I'm curious if sort of how well do you think sort of all of this nuance and the places where there's less nuance, right? Both the contrast and the complexity. How are governments doing in sort of understanding this broader landscape? Curious about your thoughts on that.
I think to start, I think it's important to level set that this is hard work for local governments or state governments or the federal government. Across the board, as humans, change is hard. Change within a very large bureaucracy or a bureaucracy that was built to build very clear process is even harder. And so I think it's important to sort of recognize step one, this is hard work. I think cities are certainly trying and I think are making great strides. And I think to Marla's point, we've seen a dramatic shift in how cities are ready for intake, let's call it, in the last 10 to 15 years. And that to me shows that they are sort of responding to what's happening in front of them and that they do have this nimbleness to know that this is not yesterday's DOT in a lot of cases, not your grandmother's DOT, as I like to say. And that's important because I do think, particularly when it comes to public engagement, the public's awareness, interest in, engagement in the work that DOTs are doing has really never been at its highest. When I started in transportation, no one thought that the secretary at USDOT was super sexy or super pressy. They were all wonderful leaders and incredible examples of sort of bipartisanship in many ways, but they weren't necessarily on Access Hollywood. And I think that we today live in a time where, whether it's because of a monumentous investment from the public sector or because of who the cabinet secretary is, there's just a lot of interest. And that's great, but that translates to the local level. And so you have more people calling their DOTs saying, why is there a pothole in my street? And you pair that with more people calling and saying, I think I saw that car with the spinny thing on it. And those are complex questions that they have to be able to answer basically in real time now. And so I think the change is there. And I think some of that helps as you're able to really partner and learn from other cities. But I think there's still some work left to do.
Yeah, and Marla, I want to give you the last word in just a moment, but I wanted to really quickly, as we're getting close to the end of our time here, Monica, just because this is one of the examples that I feel like, sort of really gets beyond talk and sort of like shows what sort of consensus building and as you were saying, sort of addressing the questions and concerns that are sort of most pressing to people. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that that Argo's done with cyclists in particular, because I think, this is a community that cares a lot about the vehicles that it shares the road of any kind. And so it has kind of a special concern or interest in autonomous vehicles, this whole new kind of vehicle that they now have to interact with. Can you just, why was this a focus, and sort of what have you all done in this arena?
Yeah, so I think what's really important is that Argo, we're focused on safety, and that doesn't just mean the people inside the vehicle, but really for all road users. And so at the same time, we're seeing US traffic injuries and fatalities disproportionately impacting road users who are outside of vehicles. And we know that cyclists are a unique class of road users who operate differently than cars or pedestrians. So in order to make the road safer for them, we needed to better understand how they would interact. The League of American Bicyclists, collaborating with them, not with realistic cyclist behavior, but also to establish a set of interaction guidelines that could be replicated across the industry in an effort to create consistency for cyclists and AVs. So to start that two-way dialogue, we had the league share with us information about the concerns that cyclists have when sharing the roads with vehicles, as well as common cyclist behaviors that we should consider. And then we asked ourselves critical development questions. So, how do we need to predict the future behavior of cyclists? How can we plan predictable and safe trajectories in proximity to cyclists? And then we used the insights from our testing in multiple cities and closed course testing. But it was important that we were able to engage directly with the cyclists to build the consensus. So we brought the league to our test track in Pennsylvania to leverage those experiences and validate the interaction scenarios that we had been testing. And all of this ultimately culminated in a set of guidelines that worked hand in hand, that we worked in with the league very closely. And we were ultimately able to say the safest way to interact, and we was both feasible and practical from the process of that spanned, to other advocacy groups as well.
Yeah, no, and I think what's really fascinating to think about here is that this is not just a question of, we're going to go and map and test in this city, and we'll see, all the data is what it is, and that's enough, right? To learn everything we need to know about the people and the actors that we're sharing the road with, that you go beyond just everything we need to learn, we can learn from just the data, but we're actually going and saying, like, how do these quote unquote data points, these people, see us and see our interaction and see our, this relationship really between the AVs and everyone else on the road. So I think that's a really fascinating example. And by the way, I think you all have more information about this is it at Ground Truth Autonomy?
Yes, we do. If you check out our blog, groundtruthautonomy.com, you'll be able to find actually a couple of different articles about the work that we did with the cycling community.
Awesome. So Marla, as promised, I wanted to give you the last word here because I think I think we've done a great job of just sort of highlighting ways that these relationships can go wrong, ways that these relationships can start to move in a more positive direction. And so I'm curious, like, what is the advice that you would give to AV developers about how to proceed in these relationships going forward?
Yeah, I think for both the public sector and the private sector, it's figuring out what that end state should be and what we want the future of mobility to look like, and then working together collaboratively to get there. Because right now it's not going to happen without that communication and without that shared vision. And that means from figuring out how to partner together, how to make sure that products are economically sustainable, how to make sure that they're affordable, equitable, and accessible. That's a job of both the public and private sector, who are good at two very different things, but really, really need each other to be able to be successful and making sure that we have a future of mobility that better prioritizes people on the planet.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to call back to something that Sabrina said that I think is so important in all of this, because sometimes it can sound like relationships and whatever, this is all kumbaya. This is all hard work. Nobody thinks it's easy. It's not easy for the AV companies. It's not easy for the public sector. But relationships that you put hard work into are the strongest ones. And so I really, really want to thank all of you. This has been such an amazing conversation. And I think a really important one as well. And honestly, I can't imagine a better group of people to walk us through this really important topic. So Sabrina Sussman from Ballast Research, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. Marla Westervelt from Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, thank you. And Monica Laufer from Argo AI, a PAVE member company. Thanks so much for being here today, and of course for your support of PAVE as an organization. And of course, we have to thank everyone who took the time today to be here, to listen into this, and to really just prioritize learning more about this technology and what it means for our future and for the future of our cities. We really appreciate you prioritizing this in your busy lives. If you were not able to catch the entire conversation, if you'd like to share this conversation with others, a YouTube recording will be available soon at our YouTube library. You can also look for clips and quotes and links to that recording at any of our social media channels at PAVE Campaign on most of them. You can also always find more information about PAVE at www.pavecampaign.org. Thank you again for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you here again next week for another one of PAVE's weekly virtual panels.